Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum, peace and shalom. I am AMWA board member Sakina Mujahida. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of AMWA's 2022 Black History Month program, Being Black, Being Muslim, and focus on contemporary women in Islam. We were trying to wait for a few people to sign in, but I think we will go ahead. We will begin our program with the Al-Fatiha prayer. I will first recite it in Arabic, and then I will translate it into English. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in. Ihdina siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladhina an'amta alayhim. Ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Ameen. Al-Fatiha means the opening. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, praise be to God, the cherisher and sustainer of the world, most gracious, most merciful, master of the day of judgment. You alone do we worship, and you alone do we turn to for help. Show us the straight way, the way of those who have blessed, not those against whom there is anger, nor those who are misguided. Amen.
Sister Sakina, please turn on your video. It's off.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Okay.
Alhamdulillah.
Okay. Am I on there now?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't see Miss Prime. She's not on yet.
Okay. Should I continue with?
Yes, you can start.
Okay. The intention of tonight's program is to have a cultural exchange of information within the interfaith community. While this program is focusing on the African/Black American experience in Islam, it does not have a nationalistic agenda. Religion of Islam is a universal message of brotherhood that was sent to all. Islam does not promote or encourage any nationalism or racial superiority of one race over another. This is reflected in the Noble Quran and in the words of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Here is a verse taken from the Noble Quran, and it's from Surah Al-Hujurat, and that's chapter 49, verse 13. O mankind, we created you from a single male and female and made you into nations and tribes that you may know one another, not that you may hate one another. Verily, the most honorable of you in the sight of God is the most righteous of you. Verily, God is all-knowing and is well aware of all things. Here is an excerpt from the last sermon that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, gave to his followers. All humanity is from Adam and Eve, An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor does a non-Arab have superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over a Black, nor a Black has any superiority over a white, except by piety and good action. So many centuries later, these issues continue to plague humanity. We pray that tonight's program, oh, excuse me, hello? Okay, hold on for 1 minute. I'm sorry, can you just, I have to mute myself for 1 second, please.
Better for I like old technology. I don't like the older stuff. It makes me really nervous. Thank God we have phones like that. Maybe we should buy another one for backup.
Yeah, the Mac went well in this.
See, I told you. It tastes tasty, right?
Hello, everyone. Am I back with everyone now?
Yes, we can hear you and see you.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, we're having a little technical difficulty, but we will continue on. Okay.
Assalamu alaikum, I'm here too.
Excuse me?
Assalamu alaikum, Assalamu alaikum, Sakina, I'm here too.
Okay, all right, please mute yourself.
Yes, will do.
Thank you, dear. Okay. All right. So many centuries later, these issues continue to plague humanity. We pray that tonight's program presents information that will help foster greater awareness so that we may get to know each other better. A few reminders before we get started. Please keep your mic muted. If you have questions during the lecture, while the lecture is in process, you can put them in the chat box. Questions may also be submitted in the chat box after the lecture or by raising your hand. Lastly, please complete the survey which follows the program. Now some background on our speaker, Ustada Aisha Prime. Ms. Prime converted to Islam more than 20 years ago after being a youth ambassador to Morocco and Senegal. She has pursued religious studies in the US and abroad at Fajr Institute in Cairo, Egypt, and at Dar al-Zahra, an Islamic university for women in Yemen. She is committed to the development of programs and the curriculum for Islamic studies. She is the Director of Women's Affairs at Dar al-Hijra Islamic Center located in Falls Church, Virginia, and founder of the DC Women's Conference. She has served as scholar in residence and associate chaplain at New York University Islamic Center. She is also the co-founder and executive director of Baraka Incorporated, which is dedicated to community education and empowerment through workshops, retreats, and online classes. In addition, she is a wife and a proud mother of 3. Now for our speaker this evening, Ustada Aisha Prime, who is back with us by popular demand. Assalamu alaikum, Ustada Aisha. Welcome. It is so nice to,
There we go. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you?
alhamdulillah, and yourself?
Alhamdulillah.
Good.
It
It's
is an
so-
honor and a privilege to be with you again. Alhamdulillah. Thank you for having me.
Well, you're very welcome, and thank you for being here. Okay, so the forum is yours. Please.
Thank you so
begin.
much.
Okay.
I want to say, again, it is an honor and a privilege. I'm so happy that MWA is having programs like this, just as our sister mentioned in the beginning about how important it is that we have these programs so that as we begin to tackle race from a position of knowledge, and we begin to acknowledge how race has affected, of course, our relationship with each other in terms of whether or not where we believe someone's contribution is to society, or where they, or do they have a foundational presence, of course, even in building our own society, that keeps us from othering people, right? That keeps us from being able to look at them if they are someone separate, someone who is not a part of, and someone who hasn't been intrinsic in one's development, into one's progress, particularly even from a societal standpoint, but even as it relates to ourselves personally. And so I want to ask your forgiveness from the beginning, as I'm having some mild difficulties. I'm currently in Jerusalem. And from those, I'm not able to pull up the PowerPoint that I wanted to present to you. Hopefully, inshallah, I'll find a way to do it from this angle. So I want to just quickly do a summary of where we were before. We had actually traveled from actually the Arabian Peninsula and all the way into West Africa, going from, when I say from the Arabian Peninsula, mentioning those of African descent, people who are the African diaspora, who were present in the prophetic community of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. Meaning, now many of us are often, of course, we talk about Bilal, but this is something that, and I'm trying to see at this moment if I'm able to share. See my screen. No, okay. So going from that foundational prophetic community, often, again, people mention Bilal ibn Rabah, but they don't mention, of course, the likes of Baraka, who was the mother after the mother of the Prophet Muhammad, his like adopted mother, the woman who took care of him. And then, of course, that carrying over into his wife, Sauda. And then, you know, even people who were closer, Fatima bint Khattab, who was the mother of Umar ibn Khattab. You know, there are multiple, what we find is a very high presence of people of African descent present in that initial community. Interestingly enough, again, he takes that first migration where the Prophet and the Muslims, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Muslims are seeking refuge from persecution. They go to Abyssinia, right? They end up in Abyssinia. They're in East Africa, where then the king Asmaha, known as the Negus of Abyssinia, actually lets them in, right? And actually converts to Islam. And of course, that began to spread.
You're muted. Okay.
Did that just happen, or how long has that been going on?
That just happened.
Okay. And so then, of course, that continued to spread throughout from East Africa. And it kept going westward. What's important to know, though, is that when we talk about the concept of Islam, is that what we're talking about is not something, and this is, I know some of our audience maybe are basically, we're talking about interfaith, and they're possibly Muslims or Christians or Jews or people of other faith. who are present with us tonight. And so it's important to mention that from an Islamic standpoint, Islam doesn't begin with the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, but that Islam is actually what we consider from the beginning of creation, like that meaning the one who submits, right, to God Almighty, and who chooses and says there's none that's worthy of worship except Allah Almighty. So within an Islamic framework and context, that every prophet we consider to be one who submitted to Allah, right? So for example, of course, we believe in Adam, and we believe in Jesus, David, Solomon, all the way down, of course, to when we cover Moses. And I mentioned these specifically because when we give the account of where these prophets began, like even in their description, when the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah, even gives the description of Musa, he describes him actually as jet black in color, like very tall, and that he has coarse, very tightly curled hair. He gives this description of Musa. And so when I mentioned that again, because even as we talk about Islam is, and we talk about Islam, of course, in the presence of people of the African diaspora, we find that, you know, throughout our tradition, that majority of the Quran actually takes place in Africa. And so there's, you know, that's a whole nother class to talk about, you know, Africa in the Quran and its role. But what happens is that a part of the League of the Arab League of Nations kind of, you know, removed Egypt as well as large portions of North Africa from, you know, saying that it's African, making it a part of the Middle East. But Egypt is in Africa, right? Egypt is in Africa. And so when we talk about, of course, the stories of Yusuf and the stories of Musa, even in the case of Ibrahim and Hajar, who is, you know, when she's the daughter of an Egyptian king. She's the daughter of an Egyptian king, and she's given to Sarah. They're in Egypt, right? Arabic doesn't come into the picture until actually much, much later when they migrate into Mecca. And so importantly, again, to understand that Islam's relationship with Africa is something that's foundational in terms of they were never separate from each other. It's only actually a more modern day phenomenon that Islam, you know, is viewed as something that is separate from Africa or separate from people of African descent. And so that's significant because when you're talking about you know, that migration that we talked about before of Mansa Abu Bakari, who comes in to the Americas, you're talking about that 120 fleet of ships of pure Muslims, of most African Muslims who are arriving. Even when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, that even though they only try to calculate, you know, a lot of historians say that only 33% were Muslim. However, considering the regions by which they were known to have captives, majority of those places to present day are above 90, sometimes even above 90%, between 60 to 90% Muslim populations. Even when they talk about taking them from the coast of, from the coastal areas of South Africa and then brought them around, even from Madagascar, currently Muslim, that Tanzania area. And then, of course, if you talk about Senegal, Mali, Mauritania, of course, closer to Nigeria, Ghana, and Gambia, and then into Guinea, majority of those places, even to current day, have an existing population between 60 to 95% Muslim. It's only when you get a little bit further southward into Congo, which there are a population as well, into Congo and Angola, that you find a lesser population. But the majority of those who were taken from the transatlantic slave trade were taken from large Muslim population. So kind of raising what we would have normally thought of historically of the amount who are arriving. And again, they arrive inside of both North America, South America, as well as in the Caribbean. So I won't cover too much anymore regarding that particular time frame because we covered it in the first one. I just wanted to kind of give that recap that how that journey happens is you're talking about a huge amount of people who are then landing in the Americas. So, of course, with that amount of people who are landing in the Americas, like before Columbus, and then a large population after Columbus. So you're talking about thousands before Columbus, and then you're talking into the tens of thousands, possibly into the millions. In some calculations, of close to 200 million who then arrived from those Muslim populated areas arriving in America, right? And so it's not possible then to separate, because there are more people actually at that particular time of African descent that are arriving more than the Europeans, because there are few that are managing the ships, but they're bringing in ships of hundreds. So in order to bring that level of population, you're going to have a huge influence, right, on the society in every aspect of life. It's going to affect everything from the way West Africa begins to influence cooking, right? Food, even in these positions. It's going to affect things, of course, like music, and I'm really excited actually to get into some of that text. And music has a huge effect, of course, on what we consider foundational culture of America, foundational American culture. I heard somebody kind of come in, so I want to be sure. Okay, we're good in terms of not being muted. It's also, you're not talking about people. Also, one of the known things about Islam is that the people who are coming speak multiple languages, right? They speak multiple languages, and Arabic inside of this tradition, Arabic is one of those things that, because of the language of the Quran, that becomes even like very much a part of their conversation. So you're going to find, some Arabic root words of things, even inside of the developing American English, right? And I say American English because American English, very different, of course, than British English. It's influenced by the Irish who are coming, by those who are English speaking from different regions. It's going to meet a lot of that West African dialect and begin to change even some of the language that we have. And so that, again, is quite significant. Now, when we talk about, each one of these has its own section, because that begins to, as I talk about the development of language, as well as, even though learning was suppressed, that education amongst the West African slaves was something that was extremely suppressed, because they were known to speak multiple languages. So for them to come together, particularly to unite, even though there are multiple languages inside of West Africa, for them to come together and unite and be able to speak to each other in the Arabic language was something that was a huge unifying factor. And so it, became means for them to escape. It literally in 1767, in 1767, it actually became illegal to import Muslim slaves. And part of it, being illegal was because they were known for that. You can't, they were different. They were known that it was difficult to make them slaves. In addition to, they were known to be able to gather people across, different cultures in West Africa, different languages in West Africa, and unite them, and, and be able to oftentimes give them, make themselves autonomous. We find this in the coast of South Carolina, in the Gullah Islands, right? We find this in, not just the coast of South Carolina, but also coming down through Georgia and then into Florida. You begin, and it's interesting because where I'm from, you begin to find colonies of free people of color throughout those regions. And so what we know about Islam is that when it continues, we see two things that are consistent, is that there is a spirit of learning, because they were known to be those who read and write. You find it, of learning and scholarship, but also you find the spirit of resistance, and that this kind of learning and studying kind of fuels this spirit of resistance. As I mentioned before in part one, that's how, when we look at, all the way from Omar ibn Said and Abdurrahman, yes, I can. Like when you talk about Omar ibn Said and sorry, my Omar ibn Said, Ibrahim Jallo, sorry, um, even Yaro Mahmoud of Georgetown, who is interesting, one of the founders of Georgetown and Georgetown Banks. When you find this study, now that trickles down, of course, into the development of the Islamic Muslim mission. That trickles down into Dawood Ahmed Faisal in Brooklyn, in New York. Then you start to even that kind of do for self that begins to develop even inside of, for some, my brain would, I'm sorry, we mentioned last week with Clara Muhammad, right? And the homeschool movement, like this kind of, we will educate our own children. And this homeschool movement became almost synonymous, right? For initially it's synonymous with being Muslim. Like then they started, and that developed into two separate universities, one of them called Clara Muhammad School, and the other one was Muhammad University. And so that's like New York down to Atlanta, reaches over into Chicago, and continues to spread. Now, it's not only that. When you have Imam Wardin Muhammad, who was the son of Elijah Muhammad and then split off into the Sunni movement, he goes and first of all, he's already learning. A lot of people are aware he's learning Arabic as well as Quran in his home in those early days. His father then funded him to go to Al-Azhar, and he goes and he studies at Al-Azhar. And now Imam Wardin, upon coming back and establishing multiple communities, one of the things that he really emphasizes is education, right? This is how you actually get the spread of Clara Muhammad schools, again, across America. But then he starts a program by which young people are sent to Abu Nur University in Syria. They're sent to the International Islamic University in Malaysia, and studying also Arabic and Al-Azhar in Egypt. So you have, and they're large, again, scholarships that are given to these people. Now that gives the light to currently today Intisar Rabb, who is the head of the Harvard Law Department. Before she was in Yale Law, but currently she's over the Harvard Law Department. She teaches, of course, Islamic law as well as American law, right? And of course, the combination, the establishment, she's currently going over, developing even a whole kind of historical chronicling of where Islamic law even intersected with American law. And this is Intisar Rabb, currently today at Harvard University, who actually was a recipient of those scholarships of Imam Wardin Muhammad, right? Like in the 80s and the 90s, she took, that trickled down into the 90s, and she went to study initially in Syria, actually initially in Malaysia, and then went to Syria, spent a number of years, kind of got bit with the bug and continued to study Islamic law, traveling into Iraq, and then coming back to American universities. It also is the like of Suad Abdul Kabir in Chicago, also someone, the book Muslim Cool. Now, Muslim Cool, very similar to another text called Rebel Music. And I mention this because both of them begin to talk about the influence of African-American Muslims on, they have literally traced the connection between blues, which then, of course, blues gave birth to R&B, gave birth to rock and roll. That blues, that pentatonic scale is actually off of the rhythm of the West African Adhan, which is the call to prayer, is also that rhythm of the way that they recite Quran inside of West Africa. And so that kind of rhythm, and even today, in even the way griots, what are called storytellers, the kind of rhythm by which certain stories are told, that it's a very similar pattern. Of course, because you're bringing people from West Africa, right? Bringing it into America. So they are taking the sounds and the, you know, that feeling, that soul that they're carrying that with them. And of course, the blues is known. It's exactly what it says, that they're telling the stories of their, you know, of their circumstances and situations. And so, of course, it's going to be able to have that flow. And so, yes, yes. And so in that, and that's significant, because what you're saying is when you talk about the blues being affected, right, by West African recitations of Quran, that the melody of it, that's huge in terms of its foundational presence, again, because blues gives birth to R&B, gives birth to rock and roll. Even what we find about that is that jazz, right? Now, this is important because jazz music, especially as it comes into New York. Now, the Daoud Ahmed Faisal, who, you know, is in Brooklyn, and the one who established in 1918 the first this mosque inside of New York. 1922, you get the Islamic Muslim Mission, led by his wife Sayyidah Khadija, and they used to call her Sayyidah Khadija, which is interesting because Sayyidah, of course, is an Arabic word meaning meaning like Our Lady, right? It's a title of honor. And so you find her kind of leading this Islamic Muslim mission, particularly as it relates to women. That movement, interestingly enough, now Daoud Faisal, extremely knowledgeable, but also a jazz musician. You find a large population of jazz musicians converting to Islam, like the likes of Yusuf Lateef. Now this becomes, America actually starts to say they should become, because of this new sound of jazz, that they say that they're cultural ambassadors and begin to send them to different places in the world. And this actually goes all the way down into hip hop. Even a more recent group that came about in the 90s, in 1990, a group called Native Deen, right? And they begin to also go to different parts of the world, literally as ambassadors of American culture. We could go into details about the original kind of consciousness and do for self, and even the spirit of resistance that went into hip hop. The people giving them names like, for example, even how I got the name Aisha, Jamal, Latifa. These are names that are very common inside of the African American community. You didn't have to be Muslim. I didn't know anything about Islam as a child to be able to have these names. And so it's all of this, again, it's significant. So when we talk about, again, that's from a cultural standpoint. Then when we address issues, you find Mahmoud's, even inside of, for example, in civil rights movements, right? I'm kind of going back to another track that begins to happen early on, that under Florida, specifically under Spanish rule, had a lot of African Muslims who are living, again, in those islands. Now, and I mentioned this military piece is because we find Bilali Muhammad, who when he's living specifically in what we know today off the coast of South Carolina, in the Sapelo Island, is that he comes and says, his slave master trusts him so much that he gives him guns to defend it initially against the British when the British are trying to take back over its control. And he says, I can vouch for the Muslims. And there's a large portion of Muslims that are living in this area. And he says, I can vouch for them and that they will stand and fight stand and fight with you to defend this land, right? But he says, I cannot vouch actually for the others. And so this is important because this is the beginning of finding even Muslims in the military, right? This kind of spirit begins to trickle down. African-American Muslims are actually known to be recruited because of their spirit of resistance. A lot of times, sometimes defending, they were promised that they could continue to live as free people of color inside of those colonies if they were to join. Some depending on, and a lot of times they're on different sides, right? Depending on what's happening, depending on the time as well as they begin to join a lot of military expeditions and asked to join military expeditions. And so you find that in Bilal Muhammad, again, you find them in everything from the Spanish-American War to the American Civil War, you find Muslims who are present. And so this begins actually something that that trickles down again all the way into 1990s, where you have in the 1990s, you have something called the MMM, the Muslim men in the military, started by the name of Qasim Rashid, in Washington, D.C., because now you get chaplains. And that's another thing that comes out of the Daoud Ahmed Faisal, is the people who are chaplains who are entering into the military as well as into prison systems, and we know this story, very similar. Not only is this something that happened in the Nation of Islam with Malcolm X, but this was something by the name of Wali Akram. And Wali Akram actually, this went all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast in California. And he's actually known for, they're known for their peaceful resolution between gangs, like his influence. And again, you're talking about from 1940s all the way to present day. You're talking, almost 80 years of being known inside of inner cities, as well as to be peacemakers inside of with different rival gangs. Again, this is from 1940 into all the way into present day that we have that. And you then see a large amount of Muslims also being a part of chaplaincy. That would lead even to my profession. That would lead to when I was a chaplain, a scholar in residence at NYU, that this was a tradition that began to become laid out. When we cover more and we start to talk about Islamic institutions, this, like, we could talk about Imam Zaid Chakar of Zaytuna University, one of the co-founders with Hamza Yusuf in California. Prior, even you have Dr. Sherman Jackson, who, literally went to Al-Azhar, continued in Qura in Medina, graduates, becomes a leading scholar with under the King Fahd University, teaches there, then comes and establishes the Anand Institute in Chicago, right? Has a student by the name of Ubaidullah Evans, who becomes the first African-American to graduate from the Islamic Law Department of Azhar University. And they, start Alim, right? And this begins to spread throughout Chicago, from Chicago to California. Again, that spirit of knowledge and scholarship that is also fueled by this feeling that this type of knowledge, that Islamic knowledge, is connected to the spirit of resistance against a certain colonization, against the certain deconstruction around knowledge being only connected to a certain thought, and that thought being one that was of oppressive nature, and looking at Islam as something that it was the salvation. So again, in every aspect of being the African, the people of African diaspora coming into America, their influence, I'm talking about as Muslims, their influence on America is just in every aspect of life. I'm actually going to stop there, and we can kind of begin for some question and answers. I see a few questions that have come up on the screen. One of the first things that comes to my mind when we talk about influences, like the term al-ard, Ard is a word that means earth, right? And so ard and earth, this is one of the origins of it. It's very similar in Arabic. There's a whole study on terms of Arabic linguistics and the English etymology of some of these roots, Arabic roots in certain words. Algebra, right? This is from al-jabr, chemistry. This is al-kemia. That these are Arabic words that are, very, especially in academia, we find a lot of these words. I think that's where I'll stop from now. Again, I saw that question come up, and I think there's some other questions that you may want to ask me that we could further the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. So much information. I know it's hard for you to sift it all out and decide what you want to talk about and so forth. There's a couple of questions I wanted to ask you. I'm not sure exactly how they tie in, but I'm going to ask them and see what other questions the rest of the audience has. What suggestions do you have for Muslim women who want to maintain the integrity and traditional values of Islam while living in a modern, quote unquote, modern world?
Okay. What suggestions do I have for Muslim women who want to maintain the integrity of their Islam, but in a modern world? Well, interestingly enough, I find that, and this, it may sound cliche, but it's actually quite true in terms of in the actual tradition of Islam. I find it to be very modern. I found it to be very relevant to present day. I was actually just having a conversation with Dalia Mugahid about this, who's the head of ISPU. It's for example, when we look at the last sermon of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, we find him addressing, he says, there's no superiority over an Arab over a non-Arab, and no superiority over a Black over a white. And then he begins to give a warning about women. He begins to speak directly to the society about their treatment of women. And then he begins to address the society about the interest of usury, right? And so inside of these three things, we find some of the top issues of our time. He first issue when he says there's no superiority over an Arab over a non-Arab or Black over a white. First, he's addressing the issue of race and then the issue of colorism, right? And so this is something that, of course, in 2022, is still plaguing us, right? The issue of race, right, being one of the top conversations of our time, and how that has, affected so many aspects of our life. So even saying to them, to Arabs of this time who had slavery as a part of their culture, and by the way, slavery during that time is not necessarily connected to race. Slavery doesn't become connected to race until the transatlantic and trans-Indian slave trade by Europeans and bringing them to the Americas. That's when slavery becomes connected to race. Prior to that, even inside of Jerusalem, inside of, everywhere in the world, the Byzantine Empire, you find even slavery can be from whites. There are a lot of different, slavery is not connected to race. That's what I want to say. So in addressing this issue, right, what he's saying is that you're going to have this as an issue, right? And then he gives us some methodology by which to address it, right? Even when we look at basically travel through the world, right? Get to know people that before, when you think your system of governance is like the supreme system, when they go into Abyssinia, they recognize their system of government is far more superior than theirs, right? Inside of what we know today as Ethiopia, it's far more superior than theirs. They then take that back and start to begin kind of like this I'm not sure of the word I want to say, but like an apprentice system of mentorship, as it relates to profession. You find, it's interestingly enough, we don't find the oppression of women happening in the Muslim world until we find colonization present in the Muslim world. That this actually, we find women being female scholars as like a norm, right? There are entire shrines dedicated to female scholars in Egypt. It's a norm. It doesn't become an issue until we till we later meet colonization. And I say that to say, because a lot of these things that we're talking about, we find its solution deep within our tradition. I find that the more we stick to it, the more actually we find that it solves a lot of modern day problems. So I think the disconnect from it, thinking, buying into this idea about that, and have to address that, and that it's more progressive. When we find that, that's actually when we get away from the integrity of our faith, right? This is that when we start to get away from, its roots, right? Like anything else, when you start to get away from the roots, attempting to grow and to spread it becomes problematic for the life of it. And so I think for Muslim women, we need to pick up our tradition in terms of learning and study. We need to pick up our tradition in terms of learning and study, and pick up our tradition of women who are a part of it. And to be honest, African American women of African descent have a high population of female scholars in their line. So I think it's and scholarship that matches their current problem, right, of their societies. So I think that's something we have to know it. We have to return back, to learning and study from our teachers, and building more institutions and being more loud and vocal. I can remember actually when there were no African studies, inside of universities, and now there are, from Yvonne Sion Chappelle, who fought for that at Wilberforce University, and that began to spread. Even, you didn't even have it in HBCUs. Anyway, I say that to say is that the more we stick to our tradition, actually the more we're able to address modern problems.
Okay, thank you so much. You are a highly sought after teacher and lecturer in a domain that is often dominated by men. What challenges have you been faced with, and how did you address them?
It's interesting that you say that, because for the most part, I have to say that 90% of my interactions have been, as you said, someone who actually sought me out, someone who came to me and said, hey, I've heard about what you're studying, what you're doing. I'd like for you to be a part of my institution, in recognizing that there was something that was missing, right, from their ability to serve that particular population. And so, to be honest, what I learned from that is not to swim upstream too much. And I say that to say it's probably, is that I work with people who appreciate what I do. And I try to focus, on the pot. To be honest, I focus on those, where does the light come in, right? Go towards that, because then you can spread more. That a lot of times we're constantly fighting, fighting in the career realm, we're fighting for, in terms of education, we're fighting in every aspect of society. So I think I decided quite young that let me work with people, because there are men who do recognize where, when they're only institutions of men, they do recognize where that becomes problematic, and how it doesn't serve them. And so you work with those people who welcome your presence. Now, interestingly enough, the same as colorism and racism sometimes can be an implicit bias without even knowing it. There are microaggressions that I receive. There are questions of my intelligence that happen. Like, does she really know what she's talking about? Did she really study? That interestingly enough, I find that I get a level of interrogation, about my credentials, or specifically about, certain things that I don't find some of my male counterparts receiving. And so those are those times I take a deep breath, and I'm happy, to delve into where did I get that information and where can you find it? But in addition to, a very resolve about standing my ground, right? A kind of, deep resolve without feeling like I constantly need to prove myself. You can accept it or don't accept it. In the end, you do right. You recognize the weakness when you don't have women in positions of power. So.
Okay, all right, thank you. I see a couple of questions in the chat that I'll look at. One is, I understand that this is from Ola, Sister Ola. I understand that there's in the Quran, Congress, Senate, that Thomas Jefferson's Quran that was used several times to swear in many present Muslim politicians. Can you comment on this Quran?
Yes, so Thomas Jefferson was actually, he often would refer to Islam, and he often would refer to Prophet Muhammad. And as in the halls of Congress, they used to have a picture, kind of against our tradition, but they actually had a picture of Prophet Muhammad, kind of a portrait, saying, noting him as one of the greatest statesmen, that he was one of the greatest legislators in terms of what he was able to accomplish in building of society and governance inside of Medina, which went from Yathrib to be this great city in Medina. And so again, some of our founding fathers were actually known for studying Islam, and Thomas Jefferson being one of them. And he had his own personal copy of the Quran that he was known actually to read often. Later on, when Keith Ellison was being sworn in, right, he actually wanted to be sworn in on the Quran because he's Muslim, and he said, he didn't want to be sworn in on the Bible because he felt like it would be more integrous of him to be sworn in on the Quran. And so when there was a big kind of pushback to that, like, can't do that. And he said, well, how about I do it on Thomas Jefferson's Quran, right? One of our founding fathers. And so that came in, and that became a tradition actually of many others who were Muslim, who were now no longer either hiding their faith or who were more open about their faith, and then would either want to be sworn in on the Quran or use Thomas Jefferson Quran. Carolyn Jallow, who was sworn in the New York courts, in the courts of New York, when she was being sworn in, she didn't use Thomas Jefferson's Quran, but she used that precedent of Keith Ellison to actually for her to also be sworn in. So again, you begin to find this spread anywhere from judges to governors to to those who are being sworn into office.
Okay, wonderful. Can you say more about the role of W.D. Muhammad Wardith, Muhammad in America? Yes.
Oh, he has a huge impact. He's the first first to give prayer at a congressional setting. He actually, kind of began to take the movement that he founded different than the nation. There was kind of an idea that Islam was a separatist movement, and the idea that it was, that from Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, from his days of actually being Malcolm X, not from his days of Al-Hajj when he converted to the Sunni movement, but from his days of being Malcolm X, the nation was kind of known as wanting to have a complete separation between the white race and the black race in America. And so Imam Wardith coming into the Sunnah and kind of feeling like that possibly racial unity that would create some kind of healing of the bonds in America. So one of the biggest things about his movement was he kind of really integrated African-American Muslims into mainstream society, taking the African-American Muslims from being a separatist movement as opposed to being feeling that it was something that was, a part of the fabric of America. And so he's responsible, of course, for the conversion of more than 2.5 million Muslims. He's the first to, again, where Muslims were now joining the military openly as Muslims, the increase in chaplaincy, you find the building of community. So what the Nation of Islam did was that kind of do for self movement. They were actually from a financial standpoint, one of the most successful African-American Muslim movements, or influenced by Islam, we'll say that. where they had, of course, acres, hundreds of acres of land, and they were producing their own food, they had their own restaurants and cleaners. They had their own planes. They had their own shipments coming in from Venezuela of fish, and that was huge, right? Initially just founded in a newspaper. And so what Imam Wafdin did was he took this separatist part of that and kind of still continued to build mosques across the country, now moving them from temples to actually calling them masjids or mosques, while also trying to build community around that, right? A deep sense of business in the community. And that movement spread everywhere in America. You will find those who were a part of the Imam Wafdin Muhammad community, known as Masjid Muhammad. I know, this has a huge effect in terms of American Muslims beginning to claim their roots, of America as well, and saying, well, I have right to be here, and that they begin to become full participants in the American society. Like it became like my existence is resistance, while at the same time funding everything from education, like Claire Muhammad schools, to sending people off to studying. It really became a culture in America.
Okay. We have really some wonderful questions people are asking. One is this history taught in schools predominant in Black communities?
There is a portion of it that's taught in some schools, but I would still say, just as majority of schools in Black communities are, still upon the, public education, are still producing they're studying from the same books. It's actually not taught as widespread as it should be. Just as we're still in the process of infiltrating, African American history, like we still need the Black History Month. And, so that until Black history becomes fully integrated into American history, it's something we have to highlight, and we have to kind of put an extra emphasis on it, because it hasn't fully crossed that barrier into being fully a part of the American story. And that, is going to require a lot more bringing that into the education system in terms of our books. So it's not something, we don't find it, a lot. I had to definitely search crooks and crannies of books and texts to find some of the information that I did. But in terms of some of the history of the Islamic movements, that's a kind of more or less an oral tradition. But you do have Amina McLeod from DePaul University. She writes a book called African American Islam. Again, you have Suad Abdul Kabir, who also writes The Muslim Coup, and she talks about the more recent history between African Americans and Islam. But no, it's not in main schools yet. The answer to that is no, it's not there yet.
Right. And another question is, medically, color of skin has no connection with person's intelligence. Why is this aspect not taught, do you think?
I think more or less we're talking about it now, because it was taught for so long. Like it was emphasized for so long, that being Black was considered, that literally they thought you had smaller brains and that you were lesser intelligent. They were all in the excuse of slavery, in one's justification to themselves as well as to the rest of the world for chattel slavery. They very much used a lot, and even tried to use like very, false medical evidence, false science, to try and say that, Blackness was synonymous with being lesser intelligent, that they were lazy, that they were deficient in a number of ways. Like that was an active movement. And so I think we're still in the process, in all honesty. America is still a very new nation. We're still in the process of undoing some of that. We're still in the process. We're less than 150 years away from, as a matter of fact, in 1918, I need to research it again, a little more than 100 years ago, and it might be right at it, but there was a movement to eradicate called the Ben Ismail people. and they used, so-called science to do it, to sterilize their women, kind of a forced sterilization. Is the first law of eugenics that was actually forced into this country. And the Bin Ismail people, when we trace their lineage, were probably some of the last remaining descendants of Mansa Abu Bakr, who had come before Columbus. But, anyway, the point is that historically, there have been some false science as well as false medical evidence to the contrary. And so it's something where, conversations like this more and more are helping us to kind of undo some of the damage that was done.
Okay. Well, I see we have so many questions, but maybe this will be the last question that we'll ask. What is the suppression of Muslim women in this Middle East, Saudi Arabia, based on? No driving alone, needing a male in the family to escort them. I know some of this has changed, but
Yeah.
but this is in relation to the statement of the suppression of women happened because of colonization. So she wants clarity on that.
Mm. So the thing is that you find the oppression of women, to be honest, something that you have all over the world. There was a great documentary series that was done called Half of the Sky, where they begin to kind of research the status of women all over the world. And so there are a number of things then as it relates to, for example, we have inside of the Christian movement, Christian history, whether or not there was, an entire council that was made about whether or not women had souls. And so this, as we begin, of course, to interact with each other, some of the spread of those ideas begin to come. As we look at, for example, Mecca, not all of Saudi Arabia, because it's very different inside of Medina. Even historically, Mecca was considered a very patriarchal society because of its terrain, because of its the rocky terrain, the way that it's geographically set up. And so even when we talk about Khadija, the great Khadija the Kubra, who's the wife of the Prophet Muhammad, and she's like this huge businesswoman that would be the equivalent, like basically 18-wheeler trucks that are running up and down the road, like of her caravans going back from Mecca all the way to Syria. Because of the danger of the roads at the time, women were not known to go out because of the rocky terrain. It was considered a very difficult journey. In addition to, women could be harmed along the way. Like, highway robbery was actually known even inside of the Silk routes, right? And so women were known in that case to actually send men out to do, even if they were the owners of the company, they would send men out to do that. And so there's a whole kind of ideology also that we hold around who has the power, right? In terms of if that's the person who's out there, that we're kind of seeing them in a position of superiority, as opposed to the people who's actually controlling the strings. But inside of that, again, you have that becoming in the agreement between the British and the Saudi family, which then created the kingdom of Saudia, right? And that ruling class family coming from Mecca, you had that set up in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Libya. In Morocco. You begin to kind of get these kings, and so a lot of this, which initially was very cultural, begin to spread, right? And it very much tainted that cultural influence very much tainted their idea of gender, which is something actually when the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, dealt with them. He addressed the issue of women often, because it was a cultural phenomenon. And so it's not, difficult that continued over time. That sometimes you just go back to your old ways, like, okay, we pray, we fast, but some of these thinking that we have still remains. So again, I see, I'd like to take like maybe one or two more questions, because some of them I see are like really. So the ones that you find, Sister Althea, that are most, relevant, I would take them. Like there was a question around Muslims, why do they call themselves Black?
Yes, I was just getting ready to go for that one. If you could, yes, please. Why do Muslims refer to themselves as Black, a race or ethnicity? Why are we identifying with a color? Do you know what former President Obama says about calling ourselves Black?
Mm. So initially, Black was considered to be something that was demeaning, right? And so basically, it wasn't so much specifically to African American Muslims. It does come up, and I'm going to talk about when that intersection happens. But this idea of claiming, right, that I am a Black man or that I am a Black woman was about, like, I want to stand firm in my heritage. I want to be unapologetic about my African roots, and I no longer want to be ashamed of that. Like, being called Black was something that was considered very, like, if you were Black, then it was an insult, right? It was considered, something demeaning that people would say. And so recognizing that we're not, that white isn't the standard of beauty, right? And it's not the standard of intelligence, or it's not the standard of how one should be. That claim, the opposite of white would be Black, right? Like, let's take it to the extreme. And so that began to empower people to a sense of, to change one's definitions in themselves first about Blackness, right? That it wasn't just, I'm in saying that I'm Black and claiming that, I'm claiming Africa. One, I'm being empowered by it because Black is a became a symbol of power in terms of our own neighborhoods, our standards of beauty. I'm not ashamed of my hair. Then we find James Brown, right, comes out with this song, "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm proud." And so that's huge in terms of a movement that even, again, it reached into music. Like, I'm not changing who I am, nor am I running from my color, which is ultimately about running from my heritage. And so, of course, this was taken up. The idea had long since been taken up by Marcus Garvey, as well as, of course, the Nation of Islam. Like, this idea of that we are Black, and that is not evil, that is not stupid, but that Black is mastery. And Black also, even inside of the Arabic context, from the Aswad to Aswad, the root of it is mastery and elegance, right? For example, if you're going to get, if you're in martial arts, you don't become a master of it until you get a Black belt, right? You don't graduate from the university until until you wear the Black robe, or even when you're studying law, right? It's not until you get that Black robe of a judge that you have reached mastery. So there was they wanted to reclaim it without a sense of shame of who they are, nor any shame about their color. And color is something, people say, "Oh, we should be colorblind." Well, no, because to be colorblind is a deep sense of pretending that you don't see me, right? That's an erasure. You don't see me. And to deny my colors is also is the beginning of the denial of my heritage, which then, says that we can't begin to recognize each other's contribution. And that's that erasure of people's identity has long since been a historical problem. And it actually is so, we should fight against it.
Can I ask you one quick thing?
Sure.
So, did you say something about, I just wasn't sure in your earlier question that you were answering, you said that slavery was not connected to race?
Not initially, not until the transatlantic slave trade, that we have 4 different types of slavery. There was debt slavery, that if you had some kind of debt and you owed it to a certain person, you would be in slavery to them for a period of time. There then was criminal slavery, that if you had committed a crime, that you would then be sold into, like, basically into slavery for that. Then there was slavery that was connected to prisoners of war, if you were involved in certain wars. And then there became chattel slavery. And all of these slavery that we see throughout history, throughout the world, these were not connected to race. It wasn't until what we consider chattel slavery that, that happens in the Americas and the transatlantic slave trade, that becomes connected to race, right?
Gotcha.
That then it becomes specifically, we are bringing in people of African descent. We're bringing in the West African population into the Americas, and even the formation of the white race in America, before was not a thing. For example, that was about numbers and political power, right? Because many of them were outnumbered because there were more African slaves, more Black people who were present on that plantation than there were white people. And so in order to formulate, power, they begin to say, okay, well, if you're from England, if you're Italian, if you're Irish, no matter where you're from, now you're all white, right? And you people are all Black. But initially, Irish people or Italians were never considered white before that. And so upon those lines, slavery began to become racially based.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I think we have this one here on the side that looks to be very interesting question, and then maybe we'll end after that. Are you familiar with the CDC race and ethnicity codes? They list approximately 1,000. Do you realize that Black is not one of them? Do our brothers and sisters from Asian and Arab nations refer to themselves by Black, by color? What is the American law?
So when we talk about, and I think we're talking about the difference between, there are three things that are coming up here. One is kind of a colloquial language that we use, right? Two is that when we talk about the definition of race, which is not so much about a colloquial term or a socialized term, now we're getting into more what we consider geographical or political, and then we're getting into legal terms. So all of these three things are not necessarily synonymous with each other. So for example, when we talk about the concept of Black, what's important inside of the American context is usually when we talk about race of people, we're talking about people who are connected to a land, to a language, to a history, and a number of things that are connected to that when we're talking about race. For example, if you're Indian, then we know that you either speak Urdu, Hind, Punjabi, Mirpur. There are a number of things, languages that are specific to that land. And we know that you are from the land of India specifically, not Bangladesh, not Pakistan, not Sri Lanka, not some of those surrounding areas, but that you're specifically from India. So what happens with what we would consider the African American, and I'm saying African American, even in terms of that phrase, right? Because Africa are multiple countries, right? There are many, many countries with many, many languages. And so when people of Africa were brought to this country, one of the biggest things that were forbidden for them is that they were forbidden to speak their former language, right? They were removed from that, and they were forbidden actually from practicing their religion. And on top of that, that there was a big force to forcefully breed them, so that so basically you got a people who were a new people, who were no longer who could no longer say that they were directly connected to Senegal, and so therefore they spoke Wolof, or they were directly connected to Mali, so they spoke Mandinka, and a particular brand of Mandinka different than that is spoken in Gambia, or very different and it's a very different culture than, let's say, Sudan or Eritrea, right? In East Africa, very different than the culture of South Africa. And so when you remove that, when you strip the people from their language, from their land even, because then there was a very huge force to try to disconnect people from Africa, so that there would stop being this longing to go home. So they would end the resistance of the fight of saying, I don't belong here, right? You've stolen me from somewhere. And so in order to literally, there was a very hardcore effort, right? Like if you spoke certain languages, the first thing is that you would be beaten. If you were a repeated offender of speaking your own language, including Arabic, your tongue could be cut out. right? If you were known to write your language, there are offenses for this. And so again, there was a very hardcore concentrated effort to remove that from the African American. And so part of that claim about being Black is also to say that we are now a new people, right? With new cultures. And we have there are subcultures even within being Black in America. There are even certain subcultures. The South is very different. If you were raised in the South, and anyone who's African American to attest to this, me being raised in the South was a very different cultural reality than if you were raised in the North. But trying to unify and say that we are Black people, that we are new people, was also a deep sense of healing over the pain that I no longer know the language of my ancestors. I no longer know their exact cultures or their customs or their exact land. Right. And so to say, and again, America is new in comparison to the other civilizations of the world. So that would create, it was also that claim to Blackness was a deep sense of racial healing from an internal perspective. I hope that begins to answer the question. And, you know, when it comes to law, you know, we're still working really hard around addressing racial identity inside of the American law.
Yes, indeed. Well, we appreciate the enthusiasm of our participants, but we have to end our program due to time constraints, because it seems like we could just go on for the next, couple of hours, but we don't have that. But we appreciate how generous Sister Aisha has been with her time, and we appreciate how enthusiastic people have been with their questions. So we are going to thank you, Ustada Aisha, for being with us for this evening for part 2 of the AMWA 2022 Black History Program. You have provided us with valuable information that is inspiring and thought-provoking for our enrichment. And are there any links or references that you might want to give for tonight's presentation before we sign?
So there are 3 things that I refer to. One of them, a great book, is called Deeper Roots by Abdullah Hakim Quick. That's in terms of understanding some of the deeper roots of the Americas and their African Islamic roots. So Deeper Roots by Hakim Quick. If you're interested in learning from the cultural standpoint of, just like how some of music affected, like basically the presence of African Muslims affected American culture, that text called Rebel Music is a really good text. If you wanted to know more about the connection between Islam and Africans who were brought over into America, then that would be Sylviane Diouf. Sylviane, Sylvion, Diouf, Diouf. She book called Servants of Allah. So those are 3 good books that would be helpful.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Do you have any future events that you would like to share with our audience, that you have anything upcoming that you would,
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm currently actually in a program in Jerusalem where we're doing a tour actually of some of the history of Jerusalem and some of the roots of, some of the religious roots, as well as some of the ethnic roots here in Jerusalem. With Celebrate Mercy. If you will allow me and those who are present, who became aware of this program, if there's a mailing list, I can send you out a list, and would be happy to share some of that. Yes. I'm glad I see someone mentioned Beyond Bilal, Black History in Islam is a new book. Yes, by Mustafa Briggs. That is a very, very important book by Mustafa Briggs, Beyond Bilal.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Please keep us informed about your upcoming programs.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. Okay.
You say salam to Brother Tariq at Celebrate Mercy. Enjoy yourself.
I will. Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you very
much. I
much.
will.
Yes.
Bye,
Yes.
it's great.
Do
Thank you
Beautiful.
so much. You guys were so engaging and gave such rich conversation. I appreciate you.
We appreciate you.
Have a good night.
Good night. Good night. So thanks for all the participants for attending. We have a gentle reminder for everyone who registered will receive a survey. Please complete the survey so that we may plan for future AMWA programs. If you missed part one of the series or would like to see our past programs, they will be posted on the AMWA website under the video gallery at www.amwa.us. This concludes our program. I pray that everyone stays safe, take good care. Assalamu alaikum, peace, shalom, and good night to all. Thank you.